Isabella lived at the very edge of the village, where the forest met human habitation, almost swallowing it whole. Her house, creaky as if alive, stood in the shadow of tall pines, their long branches seemingly wrapping around it, trying to shield it from prying eyes. Once the house had been isolated, far from the other buildings. But over time, the forest had been steadily advancing. Years had passed, and it reclaimed the land, pushing the village back until Isabella's house stood on the border of two worlds, the human and the wild. Here, among thick underbrush, moss-covered paths, and the rustling of leaves, she felt truly at home. Each day began the same way. The smell of freshly brewed herbal tea filled the house, and the morning light, streaming through thick curtains, painted the walls with golden stripes. Her life was slow, almost ritualistic. Here, alone with nature, she found peace. But even in this silence, shadows lingered. They hid in her memories, reminding her of a past she tried to leave behind her doorstep. Isabella remembered the lessons her grandmother Agatha had taught her. The memories of her were as bright as sun glints on water. Grandma always sat by the hearth with a cup in her hands, gazing into the distance as if she could see things others couldn't. She would say, "Remember, my dear, herbs can heal the body, and water, the soul. Stones are keepers of wisdom, and the wind, a bearer of truth. But there is a force you cannot tame, fate. It cannot be avoided or changed." These words sounded like a warning, but back then, in her youth, Isabella didn't take them seriously. She laughed, spun around the house singing little songs, and didn't believe in destiny. It seemed to her that life was in her hands, that she could choose where to go and what to feel. But the years showed her how terribly wrong she was. Once she was young, full of hopes and dreams. Her heart burned with a desire to see the world, uncover its secrets, and experience joy. That day, many years ago, her dreams seemed so close. The village was holding a fair, a rare and much anticipated event. Isabella wore her best dress, made of light blue fabric that reminded her of the sky. Her dark, thick hair shone in the sunlight. She walked through the fair, inhaling the scent of gingerbread and roasted nuts, and couldn't help but smile. And then she saw him. His name was Ethan, and he was a sailor. Young, tall, with eyes the color of the sea. He stood at a stall, absent-mindedly sorting through charms. Something about his movements caught her eye. Maybe it was his confidence, or the ease with which he seemed to exist outside of time. Their gazes met, and in that instant, everything changed. In his eyes was the promise of adventure that Isabella had long sought. They spent the day together, as if they were old friends, and in the evening Ethan told her of his travels. His voice, deep and warm, pulled her in, painting pictures of distant lands. He spoke of cities built of white stone, shores where the sand sparkled like gold, and a sea that never forgives weakness. Isabella listened, breathless, and felt her heart drawn to him, like a beacon. But that evening, Grandma Agatha looked at her for the first time, as if she could see her future. She said nothing, only tightened her grip on her old wooden charm, a symbol of protection. Years passed since then. The fate Agatha had spoken of relentlessly caught up with Isabella. She lost Ethan. It was a story she didn't like to recall, but the memories lived in her heart like scars. She blamed herself for that day, for that moment when her eyes met his, for the choice she made, for the dreams that, as it turned out, cost too much. Now, at the edge of the forest, she tried to find peace. Her days were full of work. She gathered herbs, dried them, and made tinctures that helped the villagers. They respected her, even feared her a little. They said she knew too much, that the forest spoke to her. But no one dared ask her the main question. Why did she live here, alone, with only the forest as her neighbor? Sometimes, at night, she dreamed. In these dreams, the sea was restless, waves crashing against the shore, and the wind screamed her name. She would wake with a heaviness in her chest, unable to fall back asleep. During these moments, she would step outside, stand on the threshold, and look at the forest, trying to find answers where only the rustle of leaves and the glow of fireflies existed. Her life flowed like a slow river. But deep down, she knew something was about to change. The shadows of the past had been hiding too long in the corners of her home. The fate Agatha had warned her about was preparing to remind her of itself. And Isabella felt that the forest, which had long protected her, would soon open up a new path for her. Fate, just as Grandma Agatha had promised, didn't leave Isabella in peace. After that fateful fair where her gaze met Ethan's, life seemed to turn into a fairy tale. His smile, his words, his promises, they all captured her heart. Grandma, as always, remained calm, watching her granddaughter, but one day she quietly said, "You can't escape fate." At the time, Isabella didn't understand the meaning of those words. She was too happy to think about it. Ethan came back into her life a few weeks after the fair. He showed up at her doorstep with a bouquet of wildflowers so bright their colors seemed unreal. His voice, deep and steady, was like music. He asked her to be his wife. The answer was obvious. They were married in a small church on the hill, where the scent of incense mingled with the fragrance of spring flowers. Their first night was filled with conversation, laughter, and promises of a happy future. Isabella thought her heart had never been so full. But happiness proved fragile, like thin porcelain. Just as they had begun to settle into their new life, Ethan told her he had to return to the sea. It was his duty, his fate, as he explained, holding her close before leaving. She tried to hold him back, but she knew it was useless. His eyes burned with a passion for the sea, the same kind of passion she felt for the forest. "Wait for me," he said, kissing her on the forehead before leaving at dawn. 6 months passed in anticipation. Every day she counted the days, hoping for his return. She wrote him letters that were sent out on fishing boats, waiting for replies that never came. Her hope faded slowly, like a candle burning out in a dark room. When the ship finally returned, Isabella was the first to meet it at the dock. She ran along the pier, weaving through the crowd, trying to spot Ethan. But he wasn't there. Instead, the captain descended from the gangplank, a tall man with a stern look on his face. There was something in his eyes that made Isabella's heart clench. She approached him, fighting to hold back tears. "Where's Ethan?" she asked, her voice trembling. The captain looked at her with sympathy, but his words were as cold as a winter wind. "He's alive," he began. "But he won't be coming back. Ethan left with another woman." Those words struck like thunder on a clear day. Everything around her froze. Isabella stood there in the middle of the dock, surrounded by the noise of people, the cries of seagulls and the roar of the sea, but none of it reached her. Her world collapsed. She returned home, broken and lost. Her steps were heavy, and her gaze was empty. The captain's words echoed in her mind like a sound she couldn't drown out. All her dreams, her hopes, her love, shattered. She packed her things and went to Grandma Agatha's, the only person who could understand her pain. Grandma greeted her silently. She embraced Isabella, stroked her hair, and handed her a cup of hot herbal brew. No words were spoken, just a shared look, full of understanding and compassion. Grandma knew that fate had claimed its due. Isabella spent months at her grandmother's house, trying to rebuild herself. She worked in the garden, gathered herbs, and learned to find peace in nature. But inside, a storm raged. She blamed herself for letting Ethan become her world. She blamed him for the betrayal, and most of all she blamed fate, which, as it turned out, was unforgiving. However, the pain slowly began to transform into strength. She started to see that her life wasn't over. The forest that surrounded Grandma's house became her refuge and guide. It taught her that every loss was a new opportunity. Grandma helped her remember all the lessons she had once learned. Herbs, stones, water, and fire. They could heal not only the body, but the soul. "You're stronger than you think," Grandma said one day, looking her straight in the eyes. "Fate can be cruel, but you have a choice: submit or fight." These words sparked a fire in Isabella's heart. She began building a new life, step by step. The forest became her ally, her home, her fortress. The pain faded, leaving scars, but they no longer made her weak. Instead, they became reminders of her survival. And though fate continued to place challenges before her, she now knew how to stand up to it. But something told her that her journey wasn't over. The forest whispered its secrets, and the night wind carried unfamiliar sounds. Inside her, a premonition grew. Fate hadn't said its final word yet. The years passed, and with each one, the world around Isabella grew quieter. Grandma Agatha had gone, leaving Isabella alone in this vast world. Isabella had survived the loss, but her strength remained unshaken. She continued to live in solitude, surrounded by the greenery and shade of the forest, where there was neither hustle nor people who once judged her. She had grown old, but wise. All that mattered to her now was her home, her space, her thoughts, and the world she had built around herself. Simon the cat and Orion the owl, those were her family, her friends, and her steadfast companions in this silent existence. But solitude wasn't emptiness. Sometimes it filled her life with the voices of the past, the whispers of the wind in the trees, the soft rustling of the grass. Isabella could feel her inner strength, hidden in her body and soul, growing, but it didn't give her calm assurance. Rather, it was like a fire burning in emptiness, not knowing where its flames would lead. And then, into this silence, into this world where there was no room for people, came a knock. Not just any knock, but one that knocked the heart out of your chest, as if the whole world paused for a moment, listening. Isabella looked up, and something inside her told her this knock wasn't random. It was summoned by some unseen force, as if fate itself had come knocking at her door. When she opened it, there was a man standing there. His face was covered in blood, his clothes torn, and his body mutilated by the claws of some beast. He could barely stand, but his gaze, locked on hers, was filled with desperate pleading. "Help," he whispered, his body starting to give way. Isabella's heart raced. This was a hunter, but not the kind she would have expected. His face was unfamiliar, but the pain in his eyes was the same kind of pain she had once felt. She knew this man wasn't a random guest in her life. With an effort that made her feel every wrinkle, every worn vein, she supported him and led him inside. There was no place for chance encounters in her home, but something about this man awakened an ancient power within her. With every step, it felt like the forest outside the windows was drawing closer, and she was no longer just helping him, she was saving him from something larger, from the same fate that had once been her own. She couldn't lift him onto the bed, couldn't make him sleep safely. Instead, she laid him on an old bear pelt, gingerly tending to his wounds. Breathing heavily, as though each breath she took some of his pain with it, she began her work. Her hands moved quickly and surely, but inside her there was a strange coldness. This man could be her ally, but he could also be her undoing. Fate, as always, was playing its game, and Isabella could feel that this was just the beginning. She spent 3 days with him, not allowing herself a moment's rest. She didn't sleep, didn't eat, just kept working, trying to suppress her own fears and emotions. Dressings, tinctures, herbs. She healed his wounds, filling his body with the strength of the earth, air, and fire. He barely regained consciousness, and each time his eyes fluttered open, she felt her heart tear with the knowledge that she couldn't leave him. She could see how life was slipping from his body, how his breathing was weakening, but she wouldn't give up. She couldn't bring herself to admit that this might be the end for him. In the moments when she rested, her mind was filled with painful memories. The hunter was just one of those who had come into her life and disappeared at some point. Like Ethan. But this was not the time to think about the past. She was here now, and she had to do everything she could to save this man, despite the shadows of her own history. He could be not just a part of her present, but a key to something more. He stayed in her house, almost dead, but still holding on to life, as if he knew she was the one who could give him a second chance. And perhaps when he regained consciousness, there was something more in his eyes. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper that made her heart race, just like it had at the fair all those years ago. But this was different. It was something much bigger. When she finally felt that his temperature had stabilized and his breathing was steady, she began preparing him for the next stage of healing. The power of water and herbs, the old recipes passed down by her grandmother. Now, all of this was more than just healing tools. It was like a return to herself. Everything she had once learned was now on the verge of being put to use in this moment. She wasn't just a woman living in seclusion. She was a healer, ready to give him a chance. And perhaps something more. Isabella carefully removed his clothes, gently cleansing his body of the blood and dirt, preparing him for a rejuvenating bath. The water was boiling, its fragrance filling the room, and everything around seemed to be immersed in some magic that radiated from her very existence. When she gently lowered him into the water, his body shuddered slightly and his eyes opened again. He looked at her, and in his gaze there was more than just gratitude, but she still couldn't tell him what she saw in him. He was still too weak, and perhaps still too foreign. But inside her, a certainty was already growing, that saving him wasn't just an act of mercy, it was an act that would change her fate, and perhaps his as well. The chapter ends on a tense note with the question of how the hunter's healing will affect his fate and Isabella's fate. After 3 days of fighting for the hunter's life, he finally opened his eyes. The first thing he saw was a wooden ceiling, barely lit by the faint glow from the fire. The air was thick with the scent of herbs and resin. His head felt heavy, and his body felt almost foreign. He knew he wasn't at home, but he couldn't tell where he was. His gaze met the woman sitting by the bed. Her face showed signs of exhaustion and concern, and the shadow from her hood obscured her features. She moved closer, placing her cool hand on his burning forehead, and softly said, "The fever's broken. You're still too weak to get up. You need time." Her voice was soft but steady, like someone used to bearing responsibility. The man tried to speak, but words wouldn't come. After a moment, he managed to whisper, "Where? Where am I?" "In a place where neither beast nor cold can reach you. Rest now," she replied. Her care for him was almost motherly, yet there was strength and independence in her movements. She seemed mysterious, but her words gave him an odd sense of safety. "What's your name?" the healer asked. "Mark," he whispered weakly. "You'll stay here," she continued as she stood up. "Your body needs to heal. I'll prepare an herbal bath to restore your strength." Without waiting for an answer, Isabella stoked the fire in the stove and began heating the water. Her movements were precise and sure. She added dried leaves, roots, and flower petals to the pot, filling the room with a thick, herbal fragrance. Mark, still weak, watched her through half-lidded eyes. There was something about her confidence and calmness that made him feel safe in her care. When the water was ready, Isabella helped him sit up. His legs shook like those of a newborn fawn, but her support kept him from falling. She guided him to the wooden tub near the hearth and helped him undress. Mark felt awkward, but she moved so naturally and calmly that soon he relaxed. The water was hot, but not scalding. As he sank into it, the pain in his muscles eased and his mind cleared. The bath was more than just warm, it was rejuvenating. The herbs in the water seemed to seep into his body, easing the exhaustion and pain. It felt as if nature itself were returning his strength through the water. Isabella sat silently beside him, watching as his breathing became steady and deep. "These herbs are a gift from the forest," she finally spoke. "They take away pain and bring life back. But your wounds aren't just on your body. You'll need time to heal fully." When he climbed out of the bath, Isabella gave him simple, clean clothes. They were a little big, but warm and comfortable. Mark felt like a new person. Not just healed, but renewed. It was as if this ritual of cleansing had washed away more than just the blood and dirt. It had removed something deeper, a part of old pain and the weight of the past. The next few days were spent together. Isabella showed him how to tend to his wounds, told him about the properties of various herbs and how to use them. Her knowledge amazed him, and he realized he hadn't met anyone as wise and strong as her in a long time. She didn't talk much about herself, but her actions spoke louder than words ever could. Mark began to notice the little things, how she took care of her home, how she spoke to her cat, Simon, as though he were an equal, and how the owl, Orion, watched over her like a guardian. Her connection to nature was almost magical, and it fascinated him. Over time, he started helping her. At first, it was just fetching water or firewood, then gathering herbs in the forest. He liked feeling useful. But even more, he liked seeing her face soften when he brought her a basket full of fresh leaves. One evening, as they sat by the fire, Mark spoke. "I thought I knew everything about the world. I've been through a lot, but what you do, it's real magic." Isabella smiled, but her gaze remained serious. "This isn't magic, it's just knowledge. We're all connected to this world, the forest, the earth, the water. You just have to learn to listen." "You're amazing," he said quietly, looking at her. "Thank you for saving me." "You saved yourself," she replied. "I just helped a little." Those words made him pause. He realized that in her home, he had found more than just healing. He had found something more, the belief in himself that he had lost long ago. Isabella showed him that strength doesn't just come from swords or muscles. It comes from understanding, from being connected to the world around you. When he finally felt ready to return to his life, she didn't try to stop him. They said their goodbyes at the door, and he thanked her for everything. But as Mark walked away, he knew that their meeting hadn't been a coincidence. She had left a mark on his soul, one that would never fade. Isabella watched him disappear into the forest, feeling a shift inside her. She turned back to the house, but now the silence felt different, full of hope and warmth. The forest was singing its songs once more, and she knew her story was just beginning. After the rejuvenating bath, the hunter sat by the fire, his body cleansed and refreshed. It felt as though the very power of nature had restored him, returning his former strength and erasing his fatigue and suffering. His skin seemed to glow, as though he were the living embodiment of the forest's energy. All this time, while he had lain there, silently listening to the rustling of the night and the crackling of the fire, he had been thinking about the woman who had saved him, who seemed like she could be part of some ancient myth. His life had returned, but what had caused this return? What in her gaze, her calmness, her silent strength had filled his soul? And then she appeared, standing in the doorway. When Isabella entered the room, it was as if everything around him went silent. There was something about her presence, about her walk, that words couldn't describe. She was no longer just a woman hidden in the shadows. She was the living embodiment of power and beauty. Her figure, once heavy and a little grim, was now slender and elegant. She no longer looked like the kind of woman others regarded with caution and respect as a witch or some sort of mysterious figure. Now she was a woman who seemed to be brought to life by life itself, her eyes now glowing with a bright light. Her eyes, which had once been dull and full of hidden secrets, now sparkled. They were filled not only with strength, but with light that could not be ignored. The hunter couldn't tear his gaze away from her, couldn't understand how exactly she had changed. Not just on the outside. She had become something else, something important, not just to him, but to this world. He admired her strength, her hidden inner power, which seemed to have no limits. She noticed his gaze, but she didn't look away. Tilting her head slightly, she brought a cup of herbal tea to her lips and said quietly, "You're getting better. That's good." Her voice wasn't cold or indifferent like it had been before. It was soft and calm, full of real care. Not just to heal the body, but to restore the inner strength. She sensed that now, perhaps, behind the healing, there was something more, something beyond just her power. At that moment, she realized that she wasn't just healing his body. She was helping his soul find its way back to itself. And maybe that realization shook her. Perhaps she had been hiding her power for too long, burying it deep inside, hiding it from the world and from herself. But now, standing before him, she felt that power returning, both into her life and into his. The hunter, still sitting by the fire, couldn't tear his eyes away from her. It was as if he was searching for something in her presence, something that could answer his own questions, the ones that had appeared the moment she entered his life. His thoughts fluttered between admiration and wonder. He didn't know why it had happened. Why this woman, with whom he had spent so little time, made him feel something he had never felt before. When he saw her gaze when she stood by the window, her long hair drying slowly, it felt like the very atmosphere of the room had changed. It wasn't just a physical transformation. It was something that was felt deep inside. It was as if she had found her shape again, her place in this world. And now, her strength was visible to anyone who dared look into her eyes. She stood by the window, wrapped in a sheet, her hair like golden threads, weaving into quiet, shimmering curls. The soft light coming through the window played on her skin, making her seem like part of the world itself. And maybe that was her real transformation. She wasn't hiding in her power anymore. She wasn't hiding behind a mask. She was here, open and honest. Isabella felt her heart fill with something that had been foreign to her before. That old fear of loneliness, which had been with her whole life, was gone. Now looking at Mark, she realized that maybe she was ready for something more, a new life. With him or without him. But it seemed that she wouldn't be alone anymore, and the emotions, the internal experience of strength and beauty in her own transformation couldn't help but be reflected in her gaze. "You've looked at me like no one ever has," she said, her voice soft but filled with certainty. I saw it. You see me differently. You saw not just a woman, not just a witch. You saw me, the real me. And I can't ignore that. You felt my power. You felt my light, the one I've hidden for so long. And that scares me. Mark seemed to freeze. He knew that her words weren't just simple gratitude. They held something much deeper. She was afraid of what she felt because she had probably never allowed herself to be that way before. But now in his eyes she saw something new. Admiration, deep respect, and something else that she couldn't quite understand. And that was thrilling, because he wasn't afraid of her power. He wasn't afraid of her gaze. He looked at her as a woman he might be ready to love. Or perhaps he already did. Mark realized that his life had changed. She hadn't just saved him from death. She had turned everything in his world upside down. He could no longer look at her as just an ordinary woman. She was something more. And he felt his heart beat faster when she was near. He realized that Isabella was his fate. Mysterious and strong, but real. And that was a revelation to him. The life he knew before hadn't been complete. He hadn't known what true love, true strength was. And here she was, in front of him, like the light at the end of the tunnel. Isabella, feeling that revelation in herself, looked into his eyes, and, as if shedding the last of her restraints, quietly said, "Now I understand. You didn't just come to me, Mark. You were sent to me by fate, and maybe I was sent to you too. But now we both know that we can't walk away from this. We can't avoid what we are meant to experience, together." She didn't know what would happen next. But she knew one thing. Her life, her strength, her path were now intertwined with his, and they were both ready to accept this challenge. As the morning sun barely touched the horizon, Isabella stepped outside her home, and the world around her seemed to pause. There was no sound, no rustling, only silence, broken by the soft thud of her footsteps. She walked slowly, as if the earth itself was pulling her toward it, and her body felt like one with nature. This was a rebirth, not just for her, but for the entire world around her. Every movement, every glance, every breath she took seemed to rewrite reality. She was no longer the woman who had once hidden in the shadows of her own power. Today, she was something else, a woman whose strength was visible to all. Her stride was graceful, confident, as if she stood firmly grounded in the world, fully aware of her place within it. The clothes she once wore to hide her figure now accentuated her power. Even the way she moved commanded respect. She walked, never looking back, yet every person who crossed her path paused for a moment, slowing their steps to glance at her. In her eyes burned a fire, alive, sparkling, like a brilliant star. It wasn't just the reflection of confidence, it was admiration of herself, an acceptance of her fate, of her path. She wasn't hiding her strength anymore. On the contrary, she was letting it radiate in full force. People who once avoided her now turned their heads as she passed. In her own eyes she was a queen, and in the eyes of those brave enough to notice her, she was a force to be reckoned with. They felt it in her posture, in her gaze, in the way she made them reconsider their own lives. It was a moment of power, a moment when a woman claimed full dominion not only over herself but over everything around her. She was invincible, not through magic, not because of her knowledge of nature, but through the acceptance of herself. Her heart was at peace, her mind clear. Isabella realized that everything that had happened was no accident. She had been through so much, pain, loneliness, loss, and disappointment, but all of it had been necessary to bring her to this moment. She stood on the threshold of a new life, knowing that this life would be different. She would no longer hide her strength or fear that others wouldn't accept it. She had embraced her fate, embraced her power. Her path was no longer hidden, and she was no longer the woman who sat in the shadows, waiting for someone else to unlock her strength. She was a woman ready to change her life forever. Isabella looked at the world through new eyes. She was no longer someone who hid from others, afraid of their judgment. She didn't retreat into a dark house, keeping her powers unused. Now her home was open, her heart ready to share herself with the world, with people, and maybe even with someone who could see her true essence. The world was hers, like never before, and she was ready to give it all. Her thoughts drifted to how her life had changed after meeting Mark. He had become the spark that ignited the fire in her heart. But not just that. He was the one who made her believe in herself, who made her truly see herself. He wasn't afraid of her strength. He accepted her as she was, and that realization was a revelation for her. She hadn't been searching for him, hadn't been waiting for him, but when he entered her life, she knew it wasn't by chance. It was part of her path. And now, perhaps, this path was ready to lead her to where she would find true happiness and harmony. Isabella paused by the forest, her gaze gliding over the branches of the trees, strong and stubborn, much like her thoughts. Her connection to nature was so strong that at times she felt the very earth responding to her, as if the power of the world flowed through her hands. But now, instead of being one with the forest and retreating into the shadows, she stood there, proud and confident, fully ready to accept her role in this world. She was no longer just a woman gifted with magic. She was a woman who had found herself, embraced her destiny, and gained freedom. And now her life was ready to unfold in all its glory. Thinking back on her previous relationships, her life with Ethan, his betrayal, she realized it had all been part of her journey. She couldn't have become the person she was now without going through those trials. Every pain, every moment of loneliness and doubt had only made her stronger, and she didn't regret what she'd been through. On the contrary, she was grateful for every moment because they had all led her to this extraordinary transformation. She had freed herself from the past, from bitterness, from the fear of being alone. Now her heart was open, and she was ready to love, not just others, but herself. In that moment, standing in the shadow of the tall trees, she felt his gaze. Mark. She knew he was somewhere nearby. His presence had become more than just support for her. It was the strength that allowed her to move forward. He was the spark that had lit the fire in her soul, a fire that would not die. And now, with each passing day, she felt that fire growing stronger. His gaze, his admiration for her strength and inner light, had become the important moment that led her to this rebirth. He wasn't just a part of her life. He was her guiding star. And now, with him, she was ready to move forward. Accepting her destiny, Isabella knew that her journey was only beginning, and she was ready to walk it without looking back. So at the threshold of a new life, she took her final step forward. The world had opened up to her like never before, and she was ready to change it, step by step, starting with herself. And perhaps in this process, she would change it for the better. But whatever happened, she knew one thing: she wasn't alone anymore. She was strong. She was a woman who no longer hid from the world, but one who could change it for the better.